All right, folks, we're back. We're swiveling for now. So good to see everybody. I hope you had a good weekend. Didn't get too depressed by that game last night. All right. A lot of people were missing in my morning course, my intro course, and I was like, yeah, they just couldn't face the world after last night. It was pretty intense. So some matters of business stuff. I know I haven't gotten the schedule put together yet for you in terms of the presentation schedule, but that is happening. That'll happen this week for sure, hopefully sooner rather than later. Also, I'll be posting a new discussion board. We didn't have one this past cycle because the exam. Some people have sent me their exams. That's great. Always happy to get them early. If you've got until Wednesday, so that should be plenty of time, I think. If people have questions about what I'm looking for, now is a good time. I mean, you can always email me, of course, 24/7. But how are people feeling about the exams? Those who have started it and stuff. Pretty good. Seems doable. Reasonable. No surprises, kind of stuff. Okay.
The only thing is when I answered the first question, I found it hard to reach exactly 2 pages. Not on the second page.
Okay.
And if you check my email,
See, I felt the opposite way when I did, right? When I answered the first question about creating your own video problem.
oh really?
Dominic kind of elaborated on that, right?
I mean, it's just kind of like, I trickled down into 4 pages, I think.
Wow.
Really? Wow.
Well, not like the whole problem itself, but like assessing it and saying like,
right.
what it actually means and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I like those kind of present, explain, and evaluate, because that's sort of the phraseology, right? I mean, so set the stage, tell me what's going on, the other stuff I need to know, and then the critical assessment, the critical evaluation of does it work or not and why. So that's out there for you. And as I say, I'll go ahead and post a new discussion for us that if you could get the new discussion maybe done by Sunday night, then I'd have time to look at it before our meeting a week from today. The plan for this week is to dig into Chapter 4, which is a long chapter. I'd forgotten how long it was. And so we'll see how much we can get through. The success of this depends a lot, obviously, on you guys doing the reading outside of class and thinking about it and emailing me with questions and coming to class with questions and stuff for us to talk about. I'm going to make the next round of my notes available on Canvas for everybody, online folks as well. And they may or may not be helpful for you. I mean, I have them projected here in class, partly to give me stuff to talk about if people aren't talking, but also as a kind of way to display the various principles so we can all sort of see what we're talking about, if it's a principle or an argument or whatever. And I don't think this is out there yet. So I'll try to get that out this week as well for you. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. That sounds like it's about it. Just out of curiosity, how far have people gotten into Chapter 4? You got through it? Oh, pretty good. That's awesome. Good. Oh, that's good. That's great then, yeah. So, as I say, I mean, going through this, what my notes, my projected material is basically just kind of me going through the chapter and pulling out the things that are important, as far as I can tell, for us to discuss. But it's always more fun in a way if you guys already have questions about the stuff, because that generates more discussion and less lecture, less just sort of listening around to me, and more helping to get you guys cleared up if there are questions. Anybody got something right off the bat that they were worried about? I was thinking just the first half. Today might not even get to foundationalism, so just some of that early stuff that he does. But yeah, Tamir.
This is just a lot of clarification.
Yeah.
Could you make a better distinction between epistemic obligation and moral obligation?
Good, yeah, thanks, that's great. So just to repeat the question for all of us, Tamir is asking about the distinction between epistemic obligations and moral obligations, and I've got some stuff in here that we can talk about related to that. The way I think about it is in the same way that we can evaluate each other's behavior, and we do that all the time, right? We evaluate action from various standpoints. We think about whether a certain act was moral or not, or immoral, permissible or forbidden. We think about it from not only the moral point of view, but from the legal point of view, from the self-interested or prudential point of view, from the fiduciary point of view, right? You might have a certain fiduciary obligations, financial obligations. You can talk about those as well. So we're comfortable, at least a lot, I say we're comfortable, philosophers, right? Not normal people, but philosophers are comfortable evaluating action, behavior. And there are a lot of courses here in ethics, and I know a lot of you guys have taken them, so you're familiar with that. It's less maybe familiar to people to think about evaluating belief, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is, what is it that we're evaluating? What are the objects to be evaluated? Are they acts or actions, what people do? Or is it, in this case, in our case, it's doxastic attitudes. It's attitudes of belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment. Now you might think, just right off the bat, there's an objection, right? That it works for action, but it doesn't work for belief. And it's controversial. So I mean, that's worth knowing that Feldman has a paper. I think it's in Phil Perspectives, and it's probably from the 90s, the mid to late 90s, and it's called Epistemic Obligations. And that's a good paper. It's a lot more detailed than the discussion that he gives in Chapter 4. So you could, if you wanted to, you could probably get it online, I would think. You could. That's a source you could go take a look at if you want a real full explanation in a professional journal article. But the way I think about it is that in the same way that we can evaluate behavior, we can evaluate cognitive attitudes, beliefs in this case, right? And we can talk about whether a certain belief is the one that you ought to have, right? But in the same way that we can ask whether a certain action is one that you ought to perform, we've got to recognize that ought is ambiguous between a bunch of different senses of the word obligation, right? So as I say, there's and I think about it as from different points of view. So should I do this, or am I allowed to do this? Am I obligated to do this? Is it permitted for me to do this or to believe this? From what point of view? Because I don't know that there. I mean, I know that people in applied ethics and other areas oftentimes will talk about all-in kind of obligation, what you should do, all things considered or whatnot. And as an epistemologist, although I'm a realist about epistemic obligation, as is Feldman, I'm not sure, and I don't know what Rich would say if he were here with us, which would be so fun, by the way. I got an email from Earl Connie, Rich's cohort up at Rochester just last week, and Feldman's been nominated for the University of Rochester Graduate Teaching Excellence Award. And he's the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, which he wasn't when I was there. He was the department head. So he's moved up the ranks quite a bit, and it was asking for former dissertation students to submit, something on his behalf, recommending him for the award. But it'd be great to get him down here, and he would love this class, especially. It's his it's small, it's advanced undergraduates. But in any case, I don't know if how I feel about whether there's an all-in sense of obligation when it comes to epistemic obligations. Because some of the cases that Feldman describes that we can talk about show that these things kind of cut across each other, right? So the person who's terminally ill, or the batter who wants to get the hit, right? These are cases where when you ask the question, what should Smith believe, you're of two minds, right? I mean, part of you thinks, well, if I were in Smith's shoes, I'd probably believe it. But if you're looking at it as a dispassionate, objective, person concerned only with the truth, then you might think he's not justified in believing it. So I kind of toe the Feldman line here on this one and think that they're just these the different senses of obligation. So another way of putting it is that the concept of obligation, at least in epistemology, and I think it's true in other areas as well, is multiply ambiguous. Just means different things, and the only way you can sort it out is just to say, okay, let's distinguish a bunch of different senses of ought. So there's the moral ought, there's the self-interested or prudential or practical ought, there's the legal ought. Is it something you're obligated to do from the legal point of view? There's the epistemic ought. Is it something that you are obligated to believe from the standpoint of getting at the truth and avoiding falsehood? Help me out now. Is that helping some?
It helps some. Kind of just, it makes me think about
Yeah.
Even though it's just only gonna hit it 1/3 of the time,
Right.
every single time he believes it's gonna hit it. That just reminds me of optimism. The reverse of that, like pessimism.
Yeah.
You know your odds, but despite that, you choose to believe either positive
Yeah.
all the time or negative all the time. Negative being more real in a sense.
Yeah. Just so we can, for the benefit of our online folks that are out there, Tamir's following up, asking about a particular hypothetical case that Feldman considers, and I'm going to get you guys to read it because I hate having to wear these glasses. I mean, I gotta wear them to read. It drives me crazy. Plus, it gets you talking. So let's just take a look at the case. Somebody want to volunteer to read the optimistic batter? This is on page 43, just so we have the case described, and then we can talk about it. But yeah, this is a lot more fun for me than just straight, flipping through these slides. I can do that, but I'd rather hear what you guys think about this stuff. So yeah, somebody read it for us. Let's go. Tyler, yeah.
A Major League Baseball player is coming to bat in a crucial situation. This player is a good hitter. He hits about 1/3 of the time he comes to bat. Still, more often than not, he fails to get a hit. Like any other Major League players, he is supremely confident. Each time he comes to bat, he believes that he will get a hit. This sort of confidence, we may assume, is helpful. Players do better whether they're confident, believe that they will succeed, and will do worse when they lack confidence.
Right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you can.
Okay, excuse me.
Well, let's wait. Thanks,
Oh, okay.
Tyler. That's good. Yeah. So we're done. So that's the case. So we've got, and this is, there are a lot, you can multiply examples if we needed to, right? A lot of cases like this. So what do you folks think about? So first, what's the proposition that we're considering? It's I'll get a hit, right? It's something like that. Let's see if I can find it up here in the ordering. Just to have it. So here are some of the different cases. This is going out of order a little bit, but that's okay. So we're talking here about proposition number 1, right? From the optimistic batter. I'll get a hit. So you're the batter. You're considering this next at bat or whatever, and you're thinking about that. You believe that, let's say. Is it something you ought to believe? And when you frame it like that, yeah, go ahead.
To me, it seems like there's a strong instrumental kind of aspect to it that ties into the epistemic
Okay.
insofar as you ought to believe it because it will get you where you want to be.
Right.
And that goes through like an epistemic channel, it seems, insofar as, like factually, like that's how human brains work. It's an epistemic fact.
Right.
So you're not like really, it doesn't seem to me like he's doing anything wrong because he can still say, I know this isn't going to significantly impact me, but I know it will, like, as a matter of, like, fact, cause that to happen.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm happy to hear more, though. I want to hear what some other people think, because I agree with, I mean, we can, so what's Feldman's strategy with these things? Anybody want to try to explain it?
Well, for me, when I was reading it, this is a Feldman thing.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, so, yeah, what did you think, then?
well, all these are playing probabilities. So, like, yeah, probably ought to believe that things are going to go the way that the higher probability does, but, like, you really don't know either way, Like, you really don't.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong, in my opinion, to believe that you're going to get a hit because you're playing probabilities. So, like, yeah, there might be more of a probability that you might not get a hit,
Yeah.
but you still have a probability that you are going to get a hit as well. So, like, the average batter might, hit 1 to 3 times, like you said, but there's also the probability that you could be about to go on a crazy hitting streak where you get, like 20 hits in a row.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure,
So,
that's,
when you're playing probabilities and you're like, okay, well, what should we believe here? It's like, well, if we're going to be strictly objective about it, we probably should believe whatever the highest probability is. But
that you're not going to get a hit.
yeah, but that
Because
doesn't
the-
really
because
make
the
sense
odds.
because there is still a
Yeah.
chance that it,
Yeah.
But
But I mean, thanks, Tom. Yeah,
Because
so,
because what I was thinking was, when you see the rain, when you see the forecast say, there's a 40% chance of rain, should you believe that it's going to rain?
Yeah.
Or should you not believe it's raining? Because there's a 60% chance that it's not going to rain either.
right.
You know?
But you're making, some of what you were saying earlier made me think, I mean, we have to, say, so it seems like you're tempted to say that because we don't know how it's going to go, and for all we know it could be different than the odds suggest, that it's what's the harm in believing, especially if you're going to get some sort of boost in confidence, and it's gonna be in your rational self-interest or something like that.
I would say it's gonna go this way.
Yeah.
But then you have equally, it's like, it's 50-50, because you're either gonna get a hit or you're not gonna get a hit.
Right.
I would say you're probably not gonna get a hit, but there's also, like, more diminished odds saying you're
Yeah.
gonna get a hit. So it's gonna go either way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thanks. Yeah. So I mean, is Feldman's strategy pretty clear? I mean, first of all, I mean, up here you can see I've got the quote from Clifford, right? William Clifford. This is a really famous quote, by the way. It's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. That gets quoted a lot. And there's that example of the negligent ship captain or whatever, right? He doesn't check the ship, and I think that's drawn right from Clifford's famous paper on the ethics of belief, where the captain knows that he's going to have people on board or whatever, and he doesn't. He's irresponsible. He's negligent, and the ship sinks, and a bunch of people's lives are lost. And he should have, upon thinking about the proposition, the ship is seaworthy, collected. He had insufficient evidence for believing that the ship would be safe or whatever, right? As the example. And then there's some others here, the chest pains case, right? And we're on the optimistic batter, and then the recovery. So anybody want to explain what Feldman's strategy? So just so I don't lose that train of thought, is this helping some, Tamir, or getting back to your a little bit? Yeah.
Feldman's strategy is to show that Clifford's thesis might not necessarily be what we should believe, right?
Yeah, I mean, he says what about it though, right? That if we have to understand.
There's epistemic wrongness and the
Right.
moral wrongness.
Right.
Thing.
Right.
Which, yeah, it seems like a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, it does to me, and some of it may just be that I've seen it for a long time. You never know. In my position, it's hard because you don't know how much your intuitions are being sort of crafted by hanging out with epistemology people. You know what I mean? Whereas if I tried this on my mom, definitely not a philosopher, right? Was with her last night for the Super Bowl. 70-year-old non-philosopher. And, I think she would probably say, oh, you should definitely believe you're going to get a hit, right? And who wouldn't want to believe that, given what we also know, which is that people who are more confident tend to do better, and just like the people who believe they're going to beat the illness. There's some empirical evidence to suggest that things like confidence in those kind of cases, or prayer in those kinds of cases, right? Having a spiritual outlook or a religious perspective or some belief in a higher power, these and other things can help a little bit. Maybe not a lot, not enough to help. Presumably, to make the case work, we wouldn't be able to help enough to make it more reasonable to believe it epistemically than not, right? But you want to get every edge you can. If you're fighting cancer, you want every edge you can get. If you're the batter who needs to get the hit, you want to get whatever edge you can. So Feldman's strategy, is just to distinguish that there's a moral sense of obligation that applies to what we do, right? And then there's this epistemic sense of obligation that applies to how we form our beliefs, right? Some of this, and I don't remember because I haven't gotten far enough into the chapter. I stopped to write it about foundationalism by reading of this before class today, just to review a little. And I don't know if he talks, if he goes on and he talks about further additional senses of obligation or not. But it seems like, it seems clear to me that there's those two senses at least, right? But other people might not have that feeling about belief because you've had a lot of courses in ethics, and so you're used to evaluating various practices and behaviors, abortion, capital punishment, and euthanasia, and immigration policies, and drug policies, and all these various things. Those are collective action schemes and individual actions. And you evaluate those from the moral point of view, right? Or from the point of view of practicality or political expediency or whatever. But maybe not since this is epistemology, we've got to think about evaluating our beliefs. And, I can imagine somebody thinking that that's not good. That's a judgmental attitude to have. That people, people say this kind of stuff, right? I mean, who are you to tell somebody that their belief is irrational? What's what are the standards of rationality in play?
They
You know?
realize the irony of them saying that.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I like his strategy here. I mean, I think it works. I mean, you can just say, look, from now to the question of is there an all-in what you ought to do epistemically? I don't think Rich thinks so, but I haven't talked with him about it in a long time. I don't know. I mean, how would you weigh these things off, right? I mean, you get a certain benefit that you're after if you basically don't follow your evidence. And you get, if you follow your evidence, then you get to be rational, but maybe you don't do as well. You know, some of this may come down to how important is it to you to be rational, right? I mean, yeah, Tyler.
Not to get too off track, but this
Yeah.
kind of brings to mind like Newcomb's problem, or whatever,
Yeah.
one boxing and two boxing.
Exactly, where you get rewarded for being irrational.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I've read a decent bit of literature that actually
Mm.
relates back to like artificial intelligence and things.
Oh.
But I don't know if that would be useful as a model to like discuss for this. 'Cause
Yeah.
It seems to be the
It,
exact kind of.
it's funny you say that, yeah, because there's a kind of, are people familiar with this Newcomb paradox at all?
It's been a while. It's somebody where you walk in and you see two boxes,
Yeah,
and you know that there's like $50 or something with the one box that's like transparent,
Right.
opaque one, and
yeah.
if you grab the opaque one, there's nothing underneath it, but everybody that hasn't grabbed this $1 million underneath it, something like that, right?
It's weird. You want to try to explain it, or you want me to? I mean,
I don't know. You might do a better
Yeah.
job. I mean,
if it's a hobbyist area for you, then I'll let you do it. But yeah, so the idea is that, and this is Newcomb's problem, or paradox, or whatever, and it's one of these paradoxes of rationality and cooperation, like the prisoner's dilemma. In fact, I think that David Lewis has a famous paper where he tries to assimilate the one to the other. But the idea is that at some point there's a person who's a near perfect predictor. And the near perfect predictor was asked to make a prediction about whether you would take one box or two boxes. And this is at some point in the future, you've got to make your decision, but they've already made the prediction. So there's no backward causation. That's important to rule that out, right? It's not, because otherwise you might get yourself convinced that, oh, well, you know, I'll just do whatever, you know, I'll take the one and that'll cause the money to be there. But the money's either, so they've got two boxes, and there's a clear one and there's an opaque one. In the clear box, there's $50 or whatever you want to make it, right? In the opaque box, there's either $1 million or there's nothing, depending on the prediction that the predictor made about whether you would take one or both boxes, all right? If he predicted that you'd take the one box, the one that you can't see, right? I mean the one that you can see the money in, right? Then he didn't put any. There's no $1 million in there. If he predicted that you'd take the opaque one instead of taking both of them, then you get the $1 million. So you're standing in line at the mall, getting ready to make your choice or whatever, and you see all these people go up there. Now you know the $1 million is either already in the opaque box or it's not. So there's $50 and either $1 million or not $1 million. So it seems like there's a dominance argument that you should take both boxes, be a two-boxer, right? You can't lose by doing that. The problem is that everybody that goes up there and takes both boxes walks away with $50. And periodically, every once in a while, somebody goes up there and just takes the opaque box, and they're going to get $1 million. So, you know, the question there is, should you be a one-boxer or a two-boxer, right? And there are details that come into play about just how many of these predictions have been made and what other background information you're allowed to have access to. But I think that most folks think that you can't, that the rational thing to do, in whatever sense of rational here, I guess it's like rational action is what we're talking about. So you can, that's a whole nother thing, right? There's whether an act is moral or immoral, and then there's whether a belief is justified or unjustified from these different points of view, and then there's whether an action is rational or irrational. It might be that what's rational by way of action is immoral from a moral standpoint or something. These things could cut across each other and compete. So yeah, but that's a kind of case where it looks like your irrationality is getting rewarded. And that makes people upset because you want to believe that, yeah, it bums people out, right? Because you think, look, I'm trying really hard, I'm trying my best here to follow my evidence, and because I believe that for one, I don't know what the alternatives are. Am I supposed to like do the exact opposite of what my evidence suggests? That's crazy. That's obviously irrational. Should I just shake the magic 8 ball or read the tea leaves or consult somebody who doesn't know as much as I do? Those are all really bad, right? Do I do a hasty generalization or whatever, a narrow sample? No, I mean, you're trying your best to get it right, paying attention to all available evidence, and yet what happens? You know, the goofball behind you in line, he hasn't given this much thought. He just saw one other person, he's just noticed this trend of all the one boxers walking away with $1 million and all the two boxers getting nothing, right? But the $50. So yeah, I mean, part of what's happening, I think part of what's frustrating is we'd like to believe that being rational is ultimately worth being in the face of arguments like, why should I be rational? It's the analogous point's been raised about morality, right? I mean, so you suppose you have a normative ethical theory that tells you what's morally right, gives us a general principle, right? Suppose, just to make it concrete, it's something like Mill's Act utilitarianism. So it acts morally right for a person at a time if and only if no alternative produces greater utility, i.e. the act maximizes utility. Suppose that's your ethical theory, and suppose it's true, right, as a normative account. Someone could still, it seems, ask, why should I care about doing what's right? Why should I be moral? Same thing, why should I be rational? I think as a philosopher, I'd like to have an answer to that as an epistemologist, right? I mean, I'd like to be able to say something back. But if what we're supposed to then, if the best response to that is, well, because if you're rational, then you're going to get true beliefs more often than false beliefs, I think I guess I do believe that, but that doesn't mean you can't construct these exotic cases where these different considerations compete with each other, right? There's what's rational for you to do based on all of the available evidence, but then again, you're standing in line, right? I mean, if you're the first one to go, does that make a difference than if you've watched 10,000 people before you go? Because that's a track record that you've got available to you now, right? Again, there's no backward causation. So he made the prediction based on whether you'd take one or take two. But, so it's not as though you say, okay, I'm going to take the one, and that's going to somehow have caused him to, cause the money to be there. Because the decision to put the money in or not was made prior to the choice that you're going to make. And people there's been a lot of literature on that. That's a cool problem. Where were you guys talking about that in?
This is just for fun.
For fun?
There's like a kind of a Berkeley rationalist community
Oh.
called Less Wrong and just that kind of deal.
Mhm.
Involving artificial intelligence and creating AI that won't kill everyone.
Oh, that kind of thing. All right, yeah. Very good. So, I mean, I don't know if all this is helping or not. Tamir kind of got us started with questions about, this distinction between a moral obligation and an epistemic obligation. I'm pretty sure Feldman thinks, based on what I've read, just to review here, that these things can compete with each other, right? I mean, it might be that if you're and certainly the epistemic obligations can compete with the prudential obligation. What's in your self-interest, right? Or you're putting it in terms of instrumental utility, right? It might be that what you're justified in believing epistemically isn't what would benefit you the most, for sure, right? A lot of examples like that. And it is a little frustrating, right? Again, because I'm just trying to kind of shooting from the hip here, but I think there's a feeling a lot of us have as philosophers and philosophy students that it's a good thing. It's a value that we hold dear to try to be as reasonable in our beliefs as possible, and also to act morally, right? To do the right thing. But I think maybe the short version is that there's no necessary connection between doing the right thing or believing the right thing and accruing any guaranteed benefit. Think about people, for example, we can multiply examples, but there are lots of things that were you to come to learn them so this is a question sort of about the value of knowledge and of truth, right? A lot of things that were you to come to know them or learn them or have evidence in favor of them that would justify you in believing them could be very undermining, right? I mean, you know, on the one hand, you kind of want to know if your partner's cheating on you, but getting that information, if it goes the wrong way, could be devastating, right? And so, sort of likewise in these cases like Feldman's, I remember when he was constructing some of these examples, the recovery case. Maybe I can read that one for us real quick here, sort of just to give another example. This is recovery on 43, example 4.5. A person has a serious illness from which few people recover, but this person is not willing to give in to her illness. She's sure that she'll be one of the lucky ones, and confidence helps. Those who are optimistic tend to do a little better, even though, unfortunately, most of them do not recover either, right? So this is another one of those where if you just put the question, what should she believe, you're probably torn, right? On the one hand, if you were in her shoes, you'd probably feel the same way. You'd want every advantage, and so it seems like there's an intuition that what she ought to believe is that she'll beat the odds, she'll recover. There's also the intuition that what you ought to believe is whatever's supported by all available evidence, right? So these things are in conflict with each other, they come apart. I mean, this is kind of a point that can be made about a lot of things, right? I mean, following your total evidence, Earl Connie has a great paper called The Truth Connection, where he talks a bit about this. So it's from PPR, Philosophy and Phenomenological Review, great journal. And it's this idea that, you know, look, there needs to be some sort of connection between what you're justified in believing and the truth, but it's very hard to sort of say what it is, because suppose you have mountains of misleading evidence. What should you do according to evidentialism? Follow your total evidence. My total evidence suggests that Smith is the killer. You know, Smith was framed. It's a really good frame job. I mean, you know, even the authorities are taken in and duped by it. You're sitting on the jury. You've got to make a decision based on all available evidence. I think the rational thing to do is to believe Smith did it, but that doesn't mean it's going to turn out to be right. This happens over and over, and it's frustrating for folks, for sure. What do y'all think about the recovery case?
On one hand, it seems like obviously they wouldn't be epistemically justified,
Mhm.
but like, in terms of the consequences of believing that they'll be okay or not, it seems to be totally in favor of them, you know, having that little extra confidence.
Yeah.
Because there's really not going to be a downside to them, but that's not really getting out of the question or out of the conflict.
Yeah.
I guess you have like a conversation reaching to believe that like you're not gonna survive, but since you get a benefit for believing that you do,
Yeah.
are you kind of like, I would say you're overall justified in believing that you are going to beat it because you do have this added benefit. You know?
So you think that all things considered kind of point about what the person should believe, where you try to sort of come up with a weighting between the practical obligation or the self-interested concern and the epistemic concern. You think that there's some sense in which we can pit these things, we can come up with some all in. Whereas I'm not so sure, but certainly you might just have this view. You might say, look, when it comes right down to when they come apart, go with the benefit.
If you get a benefit out of it, then I think then it's okay to be like what you might call irrational.
Yeah.
Because like, you know, obviously you're gonna be, you know, strict irrational. You look at it like, hey, you know, your odds of beating this are one and not very many.
Mm-hmm.
If your goal in the end is to get a benefit, then it's not irrational, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And if
If your
your
Yeah.
goal
goal
is to beat the illness that
Yeah.
you have,
Yeah.
then it seems like you're almost like rational and justified in seeming to be irrational. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's getting weird now. It's getting hazy for me. You know.
Instrumentally justified, but not epistemically justified.
Yeah, or prudentially justified or pragmatically justified. Yeah, I mean, I guess so. There's several different questions here, right? I mean, hopefully there'll be lots of cases where what's in your rational self-interest in terms of benefit will dovetail with what you're epistemically justified in believing, right? And just to be clear, by epistemic justification, what we're talking about is the kind of justification that's required by the third condition on the traditional analysis of knowledge, right? It's a sort of justification that can turn a true belief that's not a Gettier case into knowledge, basically. So there'll be hopefully a lot of cases where they coincide, but the point, I guess, here is just in thinking about Clifford's thesis, right? How are we going to get out of these kind of cases? And Feldman's strategy is to just say, well, look, I mean, there's what you ought to do from the standpoint of morality, and there's what you ought to do believe from the standpoint of epistemic rationality. There's practical and prudential and self-interested considerations as well. My thinking is just that in the cases like recovery and the Batter case, I mean, it might be that the epistemic sense and the prudential sense are just incommensurable. I don't know that, and this is kind of, it may not even turn out to be a big deal, whether we say that there's an all-in sense, or whether we just say there are these distinct senses, and when they do conflict, they're incommensurable, and you need some meta principle or something to select or to pick from, or maybe it just you say, look, I mean, the person's free to do whatever they want to do in a case like that, right? Depends on what you value. If you value following your evidence because you think that's what's most likely to get you at the truth, and the truth is this really important thing that you want, that's different than saying, hey, I'm willing to be aware that I'm being epistemically irrational from time to time to get whatever benefit's going to accrue, right? I mean, religious belief comes to mind in these kind of cases, right? And I mean, the Newcomb problem is often sort of used as a sort of in discussions of religious belief. The idea being that, well, you've got mountains of, let's just suppose that the preponderance of the evidence, the total evidence for thinking that God exists isn't that great, and that you've got either better evidence for being agnostic or maybe even for adopting an atheistic stance, right? But it turns out that the people who have faith and are irrational, epistemically irrational, that is, right? So if there's a God, then they get a big reward. Again, there's a lot of assumptions built into this, right? It's like a Pascal's wager kind of deal where you sort of, we have to also assume that God rewards the believers and punishes the unbelievers regardless of the motivations for their belief and all this sort of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, nobody ever said that being irrational can't get you some stuff, right? It's just, I think what happens is when those cases come into conflict, that's when it gets hard. So the good news is that a lot of the time, let's hope that they don't, right? So what's epistemically justified? I'm contemplating crossing the street. The stoplight is red, and there's cars coming, and if I walk out, I'll get hit. I don't want to get hit. That's not part of what I'm after for today, right? And so my evidence the good news is all of my evidence makes it reasonable for me to believe that I shouldn't walk across the street, and moreover, it's in my practical self-interest to not walk across the street. So, tons of cases where they'll coincide with each other. Some pretty good. Well, what other stuff do you guys want to talk about in here?
Could you just do more of an overview of supervenience? I think
Yeah.
I understand, but just to...
That's good stuff too. Yeah. Anybody else have questions about supervenience? Probably just out of curiosity, in other philosophy classes that you've had, have people had discussions of supervenience there? A little bit, Alan? In what?
Isn't it something that's not really a moral obligation?
Well, so, I mean, which class was it in?
Food ethics, yeah. I remember
Oh.
food ethics, and I remember
Or I'm thinking of supererogatory.
You're super.
Oh, supererogatory and oh yeah, so yeah, that's going above. So just to be clear,
Wrong super word.
right? They both had super in them. Yeah. So there's supererogatory, which is a technical term in meta ethics, and what that is an act is supererogatory if it's above and beyond the call of duty, right? So there are going to be cases where there's something that you're permitted to do, but you're not required to do it. And then there are cases where you're required to do the thing in question. And then there are cases where it would be really nice if you did it, but it's not a requirement. So you're kind of going above what morality demands. So that's supererogatory action. That's a different concept from the concept here of supervenience. So let me go ahead, I'll push this down to where we can see it. So yeah, I love talking about supervenience. It's one of my favorite things. I wish I knew a lot more about it though. It's kind of a weird word that you may or may not come across or have come across before. But the idea is that, and this is, I think, Feldman has a good discussion of it. And actually, the example that I talked about last time about the two students and their papers, he uses that example in there, right, to illustrate a point. And so, roughly, supervenience is a way of describing a determination relationship between, in this case, properties at different levels. So we have this sort of distinction between what we'll call the descriptive properties and the evaluative properties. I'm not going to distinguish between evaluative properties and normative properties for our purposes here. We'll just, it's kind of like propositions and statements, so you can use them interchangeably. So you might ask yourself, what makes an evaluative judgment or a normative judgment true? Like we say that Jones is morally permitted to do X, or that Smith is obligated to do Y, that Brown is justified in believing, or that object X is a work of art, right? Across the board, these are all evaluative judgments. They're all ranking, assessing, appraising something from some particular point of view, whether it's the propriety of the rationality of a belief, or the morality of an action, or the aesthetic quality of a work of art, right? And on and on and on. And if you get to thinking about this stuff, it can seem kind of mysterious because you're thinking, well, these intuitive judgments about the evaluative levels seem correct, but what makes them true, right? So supervenience has been put to a lot of use in this area. I think it probably first got talked about, maybe it was in ethics, but certainly it gets discussed a lot in metaphysics as well. And it's, as I say, it's a way of determining a relationship between properties at two different levels. So think of them as, I'll just use A and B to make it obvious. So we've got the B level, and then actually I want to switch them because I want this to be the base. So this is the base right here, the B level properties, and they give rise to what I'll call the A level properties. All right, the A level properties are these higher order properties, like being morally obligated, being epistemically justified, being a work of art, and on and on and on. The base properties here are non-evaluative properties. They're purely descriptive properties. All right, whereas the A level properties are the evaluative properties. And the idea is that any two things, whether they're entities or properties or actions, whatever you want, any two that are duplicates at the base level have to be duplicates at the higher level, right? And think about the mind-body problem, right? Suppose that some version of psychophysical supervenience of mind on body or mental states on brain states is plausible. Then what that would mean is that any two creatures that were exactly alike, molecule for molecule duplicates with respect to their brain states, would have to be exactly alike with respect to what thought they're thinking, for example. So in the case of what we're talking about with epistemic justification, there are going to be some states, right? There's some features that are going to determine, these descriptive features, that are going to determine and give rise to these epistemic properties. So we say that the epistemic properties supervene on the lower level properties, right? Now he's got the thesis up here, right? I've got it stated here. One property supervenes on another, just in case it's impossible for two objects to be exactly alike with respect to the lower level, the G level in the case of my example, without being exactly indifferent with respect to the higher level. So any difference at the higher level has to be reflected in some difference at the lower level. Take those papers that the two students wrote that turned out coincidentally to be duplicates of each other, right? When the professor says that one's an A and one's a C, and the student wants to know how that could be, it seems right to think that, well, look, it can't just That's not the way these evaluations or these evaluative properties, normative properties work. They're not just free-floating. They've got to be constituted out of something, right? I think Moore talks about this, G.E. Moore. So the epistemic supervenience principle that Feldman's got here, necessarily if two beliefs have the same non-epistemic properties, then they have the same epistemic properties. In other words, if two beliefs are exactly alike non-epistemically, then either both are justified or both are not justified, or they're justified to the same degree. Yeah, Tamir.
I might just be nitpicky right now, but that's the case with those two papers.
Yeah.
Written the exact same word for word.
Yeah.
There is one small difference.
Yeah.
That would just be the time in which they were read or maybe submitted.
Oh, okay. So you're trying to find a difference.
Like, yeah. If
Yeah,
at
okay.
the base level, the only part where they're different is time.
Yeah.
And if you want.
And who wrote 'em?
Yeah.
Who wrote them? That's what I mean. So good, thanks. So Tamir's saying there, in the case of the case where there's the two papers that the students wrote, and they turn out coincidentally to be basically the same paper, right? But and keep in mind that we're meaning really the same in the sense that it's letter for letter, word for word, punctuation mark for punctuation mark, footnotes, everything's the same. And the professor says the one's an A and one's a C. Most of us, I hope you guys have this intuition, that that's messed up. That can't be, because whatever else you want to think about these high-level properties, like being an A or being a C, being an excellent work or being a mediocre work or an average work, right? We can go on and on about what the determining features are and exactly how they do the determining and all of that, but we can bypass some of that for right now and just try to make the first point, which is that it does seem right to say that those kinds of evaluative properties, they don't just come out of thin air, right? They're not just popping out of nothing. They have to get built somehow. And a good candidate for some of the constituting properties at the lower level, right, and that are going to be things like punctuation, spelling, the number of typos, the style, the footnoting, on and on and on. Those are all things that can be described without having to invoke any evaluative notions or concepts, right? Tamir is pointing out that, well, there could be some other differences between the papers, right? Namely, the times they were submitted, the people who wrote them clearly are different people. They shouldn't be. The intuition's supposed to be that they shouldn't. But notice that, thanks, I like that little detail point. Notice that not everything and here's a part of the larger debate in the supervenience community, is sort of figuring out what the appropriate base level properties are, how broadly or how narrowly to constrict the base or expand the base. Because suppose that, don't ever do this, by the way, this would be bad advice, but suppose that you and your brother-in-law get the bright idea Saturday afternoon to start making your own money. It's just not worth having to work as hard as you're having to work to get that measly amount of cash. And so with all this fancy computer technology and all the fancy ink and whatnot, you are able somehow, you and your brother-in-law in the basement or in the garage or the tool shed or whatever, you start printing up $100 bills, right? And this is science fiction, fantasy, whatever. It's not going to happen, but especially nowadays with the way those new bills are, right? With the Mylar strip and a hologram and the crazy ink that does all this weird stuff. But just suppose that you really could produce counterfeit $100 bills that were microphysically indistinguishable from legitimate $100 bills, right? You want to say, well, look, I mean, what makes a thing a legitimate $100 bill, which isn't a normative evaluative assessment of the thing? What makes it legitimate? Well, does the legitimacy of a piece of currency, of it being legal tender, having that evaluative status, is that determined by a purely physical base? Seems like it's not. It seems like in addition to the purely physical base, by that I just mean the ink and the threads and the paper and the Mylar and the hologram. Yeah, there's all of that, but also the causal history, the way the thing came about. You and your brother-in-law working in the basement, you're not authorized. You're not duly authorized by the federal government to make money, right? but the U.S. Mint can do it, or the Federal Reserve can do it, or whoever it is that's doing it, right? So sometimes it's not just the purely physical things that are relevant to be put in the base, what I'm calling the microphysical features, but the causal features as well, right? The ancestry, or how this thing came about, how it originated. Again, a lot of art forgery out there. There are folks, I think a lot of the Chinese artists are some of the best forgers in the world. And they might be able to paint a Monet that would be, for everyone except a few experts in the world, indistinguishable from a real thing, and pawn it off as the real McCoy, right? Suppose you had two that were exactly alike at the base level. Still, the one's a great work of art, and the other one's just a forgery. It's a fake, right? Because again, how it came into being counts. That makes a difference. So, Feldman gives some examples of things that would count as non-evaluative facts. See if I can find them here for us. I'm out of order, so bear with me. So yeah, here we go. And this is going to be relevant later on, little further into the course, when we start in chapter 5, when he starts talking about non-evidentialist theories of epistemic justification. So there's a sort of area of debate within epistemology that you're gradually getting up to speed enough to be a part of that debate, which is fun. I like it a lot. It's called the internalism-externalism debate. And it really has to do with what the justification-making features are. In short, briefly, are the justification-making features the sorts of things that the agent has to have cognitive awareness or access to? They're appropriately internal to the mind of the agent. Or are the epistemic-making features, the justification-making features of, say, a belief, can they include things that are external to the awareness or the access of the person in question? So these would be up here, right, the kind of things he's talking about, the non-evaluative or non-epistemic aspects, things like the causal sequence that led to you getting the belief, how reliable the process by which the belief was formed is, whether other people believe the same things, truth obviously is going to be out there, the agent's experiential state, other beliefs the agent has, yeah.
Those are non-epistemic.
Well,
Or,
he's talking that way about them. Which?
I mean, it seems like all of them are grounded in an epistemic fact to me.
Really?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the cause of your belief is a physical process, and you take the information and being processed. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure we can always see that and have
Yeah.
access, but I think I don't know, to me it seems epistemic.
Okay. Let me say something back and see if this helps. So think about the traditional analysis of knowledge. We just got done doing that. We saw Gettier and some different issues that come up there. When you think about the three conditions, the only one of those that seems to be it's epistemic and it's appropriately internal, I think, is the third condition, the justification condition. Belief's a psychological thing, and truth is external. So I wouldn't count truth or belief as epistemic in the sense that he's intending. So likewise, causal chains and reliable processes, or the processes whereby the belief is formed, obviously what other people think, to me that's not epistemic. You might wonder about the agent's experiential state. So if you're having a certain visual experience or a certain auditory experience, and likewise for what other beliefs you've got. But again, the other beliefs you've got, there's nothing essentially epistemic about them. They're psychological, right?
Well, I mean, but isn't that the same as saying, like, it's the same as an epistemic thing that cup is sitting on the table, regarding their beliefs.
Yeah, I'm struggling here, Tyler. Help me, man. I
I don't know, the brain is a physical thing, so it seems like it's an epistemic fact about your belief is. It doesn't exist outside of, like, reality, It's
Yeah.
still a physical fact. At least that's my worldview, so that
Yeah.
might be
I guess maybe we're just hung up on our use of the word epistemic. When I'm using it as a modifier, and the way Feldman's using it, I think, is of or pertaining to knowledge,
okay.
as opposed to connected somehow with a conscious experience of a person, or somehow part of how people cognitively get the things they get. I mean, there's all that work done too, right, in cognitive science.
I think it's just because my idea of what we can get knowledge from is only physical, so that
Yeah.
kind of informs the rest But I see, I understand
Okay.
why you do it.
Okay, good. That helps because yeah, it's always worrisome to me when I feel like we're lost at sea here. We're adrift, right? So yeah, I mean, if you just think about it narrowly as like of or pertaining to knowledge specifically, because keep in mind that a lot of these other things are sort of, I mean, obviously the agent's beliefs and the agent's experiences are part of what Feldman ultimately takes your evidence to consist in, right? I mean, that's a hard question. So we're on our way to formulating evidentialism, right? That's where this is headed. And the idea is, well, roughly, that what you're justified in believing at a time with respect to a proposition is whatever's supported by your total evidence at that time concerning that proposition, right? So then you want to say, okay, well, what's my total evidence? Well, I think we've talked before, but it maybe bears repeating that there's that distinction, right, between total evidence and conclusive evidence. People feel good about that now? Yeah. So the total basically is just, it's your own balance evidence or your net evidence. It's what you get when you subtract, figuratively, all the reasons for thinking something's not true from all the reasons for thinking that it is. And you get the seesaw metaphor, right? It's either going to, on balance, favor reasons for thinking it's true, on balance, favor reasons for thinking that it's not true, or these things are going to basically just neutralize each other, either because there's no evidence either way or because they completely offset one another and it's kind of implode. And so you get the counterbalance situation on the seesaw where you're just suspending judgment, right? So then the question is, well, what exactly constitutes my evidence that I'm accorded right now? What Feldman wants to say is, and he has another paper that I can steer you to if you want additional, more details, it's a good paper, it's called Having Evidence. I think that was in Phil Review. And Philosophical Review is one of probably the top 5 philosophy journals in the Anglo-American analytic philosophical world. So a really good paper. Or maybe that was the Fallibilism and Knowing That One Knows paper. But in any case, what he wants to say is that your total evidence right now is all of your experiences together with, let's say, your other justified beliefs. So beliefs and experiences. And if you've read the whole chapter, which it seems like most people did, which is good, I'm really proud of you guys. I wish I could get my intro kids to read like that. I don't think half of them bought the book. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's just really, it's bad. And you wonder like why I got a really bad grade. I never read any, never came to class. I didn't do any of the stuff I was supposed to do.
Most likely it'll happen.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Right. So, in any case, that's your evidence. And Feldman makes some interesting points about this, right? I mean, people can misevaluate their evidence. Evidence can be misleading. Just thinking that something's evidence for something isn't enough to make it evidence for something. One of the hardest questions of all, I remember because at one point I toyed briefly with the idea of it for a dissertation proposal, is the question of what makes one thing evidence for another thing. It's sort of, that's kind of that's the holy grail for evidentialism, is sort of trying to spell out exactly in virtue of what it is that something is evidence for something else. And it turns out to be a really hard problem that there's, I don't think, much consensus about. But bear all of that in mind, right? I mean, so the answer, as I say here at the bottom, is, what is it that ultimately determines the epistemic status of a belief? The epistemic status being akin to the high-level property, right? It's kind of like being the A paper. What determines that? Well, the non-evaluative features, according to the evidentialist account, we can just call them reasons, right? You may think, well, wait a minute. I mean, how can he get out of that or get to say that? I mean, isn't the concept of something's being a reason essentially normative or evaluative and not a descriptive concept? Something to think about. And maybe be worried about the concept of a reason. What do you folks think? Do you think it's descriptive or normative, or does anybody else have that feeling? That we can't explain what a reason is without basically getting caught in a circle that's going to involve ultimately us being bound up with more normative concepts. That'd be bad news, though, for evidentialism. If part of your program is that you also like evidentialism and you think it seems, we haven't seen the rival theories, right? And as he says in the chapter, right? I mean, there are a lot of different versions of, there are a lot of different theories out there that can all claim to be evidentialist in spirit, but then they just spell out what counts as evidence in different ways, right? Whether the evidence-making features, I think the big divide really is between the internalist camp and the externalist camp. Internalists are people who think that whatever it is that makes for justification has to be something that is internally accessible in the relevant sense of internal, right? Internal to the conscious mind of the agent, right? Whereas the externalist crowd are people that would say things like, well, look, no, I mean, you could be justified in believing something, say, based on how reliable the process was that got you the belief, even if you don't have any access to the reliability of that process. You're unaware that it's real. I mean, this works best in the cases of perceptual beliefs, right? That's the easy case. It's not easy, but it's the best case to start with because, you know, right now a lot of my beliefs are being formed visually, right? Visually produced beliefs. And I take it for granted, and the standard view takes it for granted, that we know a lot of things, visually speaking, about our immediate environment. How is that? Why is that? Well, because we see it, right? Now, there's a complicated process that has to be executed in order for that to all go off right, for me to correctly be said to see the cup on the table, let's say. I have no idea about the details of all of that, right? I'm a philosophy professor. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not an ophthalmologist. I'm not somebody who knows the details of the visual system at all. It's beyond me. I don't have access. I certainly don't know much about the reliability of mine in terms of the real, if you're going to really try to pin it down. Sometimes my vision seems pretty reliable, sometimes it doesn't, like all of yours, right? I mean, it depends on various extenuating circumstances and cases. There are cases and then there are cases. So, you know, but the reliabilist could say something like, well, look, it's in virtue of the fact that your visual beliefs under these kinds of conditions are reliably produced that they count as being justified, right? Whereas the internalist is going to want to say something else. They're going to have to appeal to how things look to the agent and background beliefs that are justified that the agent has about how things have been in the past. And when they look that way, then they more often than not turn out to be that way. And maybe some track record arguments. Certainly memory's going to play a role. Testimony may play a role. So all those basic sources that we began the semester with, right? Those are the sources of our knowledge, but they're sourced as part of our evidence that we've got. That's where we get that stuff, right? Is from our beliefs and our experiences, and then they work synergistically, right? With the testimony, the reasoning, the memory, the introspection, the rational insight, even, which I know people are skeptical of. We'll get to talk about that. We'll get to talk about that at some point. Gotta love the a priori. I mean, almost all of what we've done here is a priori, right? It's armchair philosophy. So, what other things do people want to talk about? I was going to see what I had here. So, does that help a little bit with supervenience for folks that are wondering about that? It's really fun stuff to think about. There's been quite a bit written on it. The person, like entire volumes and dissertations and on and on, lots of articles. One person to go to that's a good source for that if you're interested is Jae-Won Kim, who's one of the editors of the anthology that we've got for the second half of the semester. Kim's written extensively on supervenience. And of course the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy I'm guessing has a really good article on that as well. So let's see. Let me go to here, see if people had questions about this. So he distinguishes, and this is, I'm trying to remember where in the book, in the chapter where he's talking about this. Oh yeah, so this is over on like page 46, basically, a distinction that's worth being familiar with. Because we use this language in different ways, right? So we need to be able to talk about what a person is justified in believing, whether they have the belief or not. So when we say something like, Zach's justified in believing P, right? We don't want that to always automatically entail that he has that belief, right? Because it seems like a kind of two-stage thing. There's what you're justified in believing. According to evidentialism, that's entirely determined by your total evidence at the time concerning the proposition. So that's the evaluative, Smith's justified in believing that there's a sheep in the field. Then there's the other question, which is suppose that the person does go on and form the belief. It seems like you can form the belief in the right way, quote unquote, or you can form the belief in the wrong way, in a defective way, right? The analogy Feldman uses with ethics is it's doing the right thing with bad intentions, right? So you end up through, and tell a story however you want, you end up doing what you morally should have done, but it's sort of, but you're not to praise for it, right? So an action could be morally right but not praiseworthy, the agent not be praiseworthy because maybe the agent's intentions were bad, right? Likewise, this may be a more familiar kind of case, a situation where the person had extremely good intentions, but due to lack of information or extenuating circumstances in the external world, things backfired, right? So my intentions are to help my friend fix their computer, and I go over with great intentions, thinking I know what I'm doing, I'm going to be able to do it, but I accidentally reformat their hard drive. They lose all their stuff, right? That's bad. That's not the outcome we want, right? It'd be much better if I knew what I were doing. So he draws this distinction in the following way. And he talks about it being well-founded, right? So there's what you're justified in, which is based on your total evidence, and then once you've got the belief, right, we can ask, did the person go ahead and form the belief using the evidence, using the really justifying evidence that was available to them, or did they form the belief in some deviant way, some untoward way? So if I have all the evidence in the world for thinking that Smith committed the crime, and I would be justified in believing that he did on the basis of that evidence, we can say that I'm justified in believing it. But I might not justifiably believe, because it might turn out that when I actually go on to form the belief, I do it based on some sort of bias that has absolutely nothing to do with evidence. Or I consult, as Feldman put it, I think the astrological charts or the tea leaves or whatever, right? Those are bad ways of forming beliefs. So I've got evidence available to me that's justifying, would do the trick, but I don't make use of that evidence and want to go ahead and form the belief. What do we want to say about those kind of cases? Well, he just says they're not well-founded, which is, I think, it's an important distinction because there are some arguments out there against evidentialism that don't seem to take advantage of that don't acknowledge that distinction, and that it can be marshaled to kind of respond. What did people think about the Movie Times case? Remember that one? The one where, this is kind of compelling, right? I mean, the idea that sometimes what you need to do is get more evidence, right? So it's the get more evidence principle. But I thought Feldman's response to that was right again. I mean, anybody remember what he says?
Sometimes, sometimes you can have all the evidence in front of you, and it give you good reason to believe something,
Yeah.
and then you form that belief, but then it's still okay to get it wrong kind of thing.
Yeah. So I mean, and
To me, that seems like analogous to almost like a behavior problem, you know?
yeah, I can see the analogy or the similarity there. It's a case where you look like you're doing everything okay, but you still get it wrong.
Yeah.
In the case of Gettier, you don't get it wrong. You just turn out not to know, right? Because the truth's included in the analysis there and the problem there. But yes, I mean, you're thinking about going to a movie, and you know that yesterday the movie started at 8 o'clock, and the movie times are fairly stable. They don't tend to change these things kind of willy-nilly. So even though you could have gone online or looked at today's paper just to verify it, you're kind of, you're not as careful as you could have been. Maybe not verging on any kind of recklessness or neglect or anything like that. I mean, it's just a movie after all, but you don't do everything you don't do everything you could have done. And you get there, and sure enough, you're wrong. Okay? So had you sought additional evidence, you wouldn't believe that it's at 8 o'clock. You'd believe correctly that it's at 7:30. Problem is, you didn't get more evidence. There's hard questions here, right, about like at what point, and Feldman kind of dances around them a little bit. I don't know that he have to look back at it, but at what point do we need to sort of say, okay, I gotta check further, right? But he also makes the point that you can take that to absurd degrees as well, right? I mean, like my stopped clock example, if somebody said, well, Rick, I mean, have you checked the mechanism of the clock? No, I'm not going to climb 10 feet up on a wall in a school, pull that clock down, try to open it up and check the mechanism. Or did you call Denver to the atomic time? And no, I'm not going to do that. I mean, that just seems to be kind of lunacy. But so there's and he makes that point, right? I mean, there are going to be cases where had you collected more evidence, it would change things. But evidentialism properly understood, correctly interpreted, isn't really about when it's time for you to get more evidence. It's about what you should believe at a snapshot in time, based on the actual evidence that's available to you. So cool. What other stuff? We're about done, but
Isn't that like saying almost exactly like a Gator problem, like based on their justification and their beliefs?
Yep.
Yeah, it does seem like to them that they had knowledge,
yeah.
but when you look at it, it's like, it doesn't really seem like knowledge. But like, isn't that something said? Isn't that to say kind of like, you know what? Like every now and then you might kind of miss the point a little bit, but like
Yeah.
to go ahead and like, because to me it seems like when you get your problem, like either you're gonna have to redefine knowledge, or just kind of accept that like sometimes you're gonna have cases that like fit what the criteria for knowledge is, but not necessarily be knowledge exactly.
Yeah, see, that's the problem. That means the criteria are wrong, right? Or they're incomplete.
Maybe, but like, does it seem more justified to sit there and say, okay, there might be atypical cases where they might not exactly have it right every single time? Or does it seem better to go ahead and say that knowledge isn't necessarily justified true belief? And
Yeah.
based off of that evidentialism example that he gave, it seemed like if you were to kind of like convert that to the Getty, you'd probably sit there and say, well, sometimes you might have a justified true belief. And it eventually is right by coincidence, but it's not necessarily knowledge, but
Yeah.
that's why it's justified true belief, and it's not knowledge. Maybe. That's why it's only the criteria for it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just saw I saw a parallel there, and I wanted to kind of like extrapolate on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, like, there's a couple steps that I was missing when I was thinking about it.
Right. I mean, so in the case of in the case of the movie times, you get it wrong. In the case of the Getty examples, counterexamples, you get it right, but it's your justification's disconnected from the fact in the world that makes the proposition true. And it's that kind of disconnect that seems to make trouble. Now, like I said before, if you're ever in one of these cases, by all means call me, because they are exotic and weird, to be sure. There probably are cases where that's happened. I mean, I think the stop clock example is pretty plausible. That could really happen. But yeah, so the moral of that story, the moral is supposed to be that that the traditional analysis is mistaken, and although there are a lot of cases of knowledge where you've got to justify true belief, it's not necessarily the case that every time you've got to justify true belief, So it looks like there's going to have to be a fourth condition on knowledge, and you're off to the races trying to solve the Gettier problem there. I still am interested in what you're talking about, though, because I think I see some of it too, that there's this kind of parallel kind of thing where, ordinarily, in a case like those movie times, it probably would have been at 8 o'clock, because he's got good evidence, right? I mean, the background beliefs about them not changing the times all that often, and it's only one day. It'd been different if you said, well, I know that 2 weeks ago it was showing at 8 o'clock. Then you're like, well, look, I mean, that's not good enough, because I don't want to drive all the way out there and this thing not even be showing. But if it was just yesterday, of course, one day could make the difference between the movie showing and the movie not, right? If the movie's at the end of its run. So, hard to know. I mean, I think that stuff about when to get more evidence and how conservative to be is interesting. But I don't know that I have anything great to say about it. I mean, it seems to me like it's kind of it's a sort of judgment based on when the stakes are high or not, right? If you're the ship captain, or you're taking a busload of kids across an icy bridge in the middle of a storm and the bridge doesn't look too secure, maybe at that point you pull over and you get out and you do some extra evidence gathering because the stakes are really high. But if it's something small, not such a big deal. Yeah, cool. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I will see you again on Wednesday. See if that'll stop him. Nope.
Just to be clear, though, on the second topic, have to write on.
Oh, no.
We
yeah.
talk